Last presentation for this afternoon is from Apriel, Jolliffe, Simpson from the University of Waikato. If after your presentation, if there's still time for questions after we've had Apriel's questions, we'll go back to some of the questions for this first speaker.
More than welcome to take over my question time. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tongarero te maunga, ko te arawa te waka, ko tūwhare toa te iwi, e noho ana ahau e te taha o awa o Waikato, ko Apriel tōku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So thanks everyone for hanging around to this very late hour of the day, even later for those of us who've come all the way from New Zealand. It's very exciting to share something different with you today. I've become a bit of a regular at this conference speaking about my family violence related research, and today what I'm going to do instead is to speak about some of the newer research we've done looking at the phenomenon of poly-victimisation with my colleagues, Associate Professor Lisa Thompson, Danelle Steer, one of our students, and Professor Richard Wortley. So many, if not most of us, will be familiar with the 80-20 rule. This is the idea that 20% of causes or inputs account for 80% of effects or outputs. And this was popularised more than 100 years ago by an Italian academic, Pareto, who noted that 20% of people owned 80% of the land in Italy. And the proportions can vary when we're talking about the Pareto principle, this 80-20 rule. Sometimes it can be a bit more extreme, the way that things are concentrated. So, for example, Pareto might be shocked to hear that today the top 1% of people own 43% of all global financial assets. And the Pareto principle is actually something that is incredibly helpful in work seeking to understand crime concentration, both in terms of offending and victimisation. So we know from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey that about 24% of people surveyed had experienced 100% of victimisations in the past year. So that is a small group of people experiencing all of the crime that's occurring in our communities. You might be maybe shocked, maybe not, to hear that there's further concentration. It's not just about who gets victimised, it's about who gets repeatedly victimised. So if we start off with that 24% of survey respondents who had experienced 100% of the victimisations reported, of those, 27% were victimised 2 or more times. And of those, 30% were victimised 3 or more times. And of those, 31% were victimised 4 or more times. And of those, 46% were victimised 5 or more times. So this law of concentration really applies. We see a small group of highly victimised people who are experiencing a disproportionate burden of crime and harm in our communities. So what I'm really talking to you about is the phenomenon of repeat victimisation. We already know a lot about repeat victimisation. It's incredibly important to understand. And from that research, we've learned that there are certain characteristics and routine activities that are associated with increased risk. So briefly, we've really pinpointed 2 different mechanisms for this phenomenon of repeat victimisation. The first is the boost mechanism. So this is the idea that there's something about experiencing a victimisation that increases the likelihood of further victimisation. So if we're speaking about a house, for example, there might be a house might be targeted, it might be burgled, and then because when the person burgles it, they identify good targets to come back to later, that increases the likelihood of being targeted again in the future. And the same can apply to people. When people experience victimisation, sometimes aspects or effects of that initial victimisation increases a person's vulnerability moving forward. On the other hand, we have the flag mechanism. So this mechanism stands in contrast, and it assumes that there are some time-stable characteristics of a victim or a target that signal their vulnerability. And so the flag mechanism would suggest that people might be repeatedly victimised by different offenders, whereas boost might suggest that a person is repeatedly victimised by the same offenders. And so I've told you a bit about repeat victimisation. I want to talk about poly-victimisation, and the reason for that is, if you recall the graphs I was showing you earlier, with the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey, 15% of the people who were surveyed were poly-victims, and they experienced 75% of the victimisations reported. So it's kind of a different way of looking at identifying these people who are at greatest risk. So my team and I, that's what we have been doing in the last year or so. So poly-victimisation, there has been some work done in that space, but in comparison to repeat victimisation, is quite a poorly understood phenomenon, especially in adults. So people have looked at poly-victimisation in children in terms of experiencing different kinds of maltreatment, and as well as in the context of elder abuse. But in the context of adults living their lives in the community, it might look like someone who experiences assault, as well as theft, as well as property damage, or someone who experiences sexual violence and harassment, or someone who experiences burglary, property damage, and fraud or cybercrime. But we don't really know. And understanding combinations of crime types that people experience together might help us better pinpoint what are those routines or characteristics, what is it that's putting someone at risk. So what are the combinations of crimes that our poly victims are experiencing? So that takes us to our research question. We really wanted to know, just if we look at the combination of crime types that people were experiencing, can we identify meaningful groups and use that to inform our prevention strategies, or at least our responses to people when they do come to attention for experiencing victimisation? And this research, it could help us better understand whether the boost and flag mechanisms for repeat victimisation can potentially be applied to poly-victimisation. So to answer this question, we use 6 cycles of data from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. This is an annual nationwide face-to-face survey. It is, actually, it's very cool. I hate to brag. So it's a random sample of households, and then they select one person from each household randomly who's 15 or older, and it's conducted every single year. So every single year we get at least 5,000 more people being added to our data available. So far there's actually been 7 cycles conducted, but only 6 have been entered into our integrated data infrastructure, and that's what we've worked with for this study. So the first thing we did is, from the sample of more than, I think it's actually almost 40,000 people now, but from that sample we identified people who were poly victims. And the way we did that was at the beginning of the survey, there are 31 different screener questions that asks people, yes or no, have you experienced a certain thing happening in the past 12 months? And these questions, it's really great. They don't ask about offences, they ask behaviourally. So has this kind of scenario happened to you? So what we did was we took people who'd said yes to at least 2 of those questions. So that was 6,537 people. We then performed a latent class analysis using a range of different solutions and identified the best fit for the data. We did that using model fit and diagnostic criteria, and you'll be so happy to learn I'm not going to show you them. And finally, we then described those classes. So we made the groups by only looking at combinations of crime types that people experienced, and then we looked at their other characteristics afterwards. So these groups weren't made based on demographic characteristics. Those were things we could then inspect afterward. So first, I'll just tell you a bit about the sample. just for some context. So in terms of age, about 3/4 were mid-aged, between 25 and 64. About 14% under 25, and 11% 65 plus. Just under 2/3 women. Majority were heterosexual. We had an overrepresentation of Māori people. That is both because the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey purposely super samples Māori communities, and also because Māori were overrepresented in terms of our poly-victimisation statistics. Although you'll be pleased to hear that year on year the disparity between Māori and non-Māori has decreased, such that there is no difference now in New Zealand in rates of victimisation between Māori and non-Māori. We also had 7% Pacific peoples, 2/3 European descent, and 9% Asian descent. And these categories were overlapping, so that's why it's not one graph. Okay, and in terms of other kinds of characteristics, we had a small proportion who had a disability, a quarter who reported moderate to high psychological distress, about a quarter who had financial stress, so they couldn't meet an unexpected expense of $500, and just under 2/3 were partnered. And on average, across our sample of poly victims, the average number of crime types that people had experienced in the preceding 12 months was just over 3. This doesn't mean the number of victimisations. This is the number of different types of crime that they had been victimised by. And so here we're looking at diversity of victimisation rather than number of victimisations. So I'm going to skip through all of the boring stuff and I'll just tell you what we found. So the model that best fit the data contained 7 classes, which is amazing that we didn't get 3, because normally when you do any kind of latent class analysis, it tells you 3. We got 7. And you can see from the figures on the slide that they were really different in size. We've got one massive group, 2 kind of medium, and then some smaller groups. And this was really interesting to start off with. It suggests some different things are going on. I'm going to talk you through them one by one. So starting off with the first class, this was our smallest. The average number of crime types experienced by people in this class over the preceding 12 months was 6.01. So that's a lot, that's double the average. Most participants in this class had experienced robbery. All had experienced personal theft, so items being stolen from their person. 2/5 had experienced trespass, and just under 1/3 had experienced threatening behaviour. And 2/5 had experienced, or just under 2/5 had experienced force or violence. 1/5 had experienced hacking or malware, or unauthorised use of card or document, that kind of thing. So you can see this is a group who are experiencing predominantly property crime, but there's some interpersonal stuff happening in there too. In terms of the characteristics of the people in this group, I'm just going to tell you how they deviated from average in terms of our broader sample. So there was a much higher proportion of young people under 25, so 2/5, compared with only 14% in the overall sample. Around 2/3 were men, remembering that the sample was predominantly women, so that's interesting. Much larger proportion of people who were bisexual or from Pacific or Asian ethnicities. Slightly more had a disability, higher rate of psychological distress, which I should note was measured at the survey time, so it is possible that that's a result of the victimisations. About 1/3 experienced financial stress, and also a much higher rate of people who were single. Okay, moving on to the next group, group 2. So the average number of crime types that people in this class experienced was just over 4. This class had the highest proportion of people who'd experienced sexual violence, including forced sex or forced sexual acts. About 1/3 had experienced assault or attempted assault. And as well as that, there was about 1/3 had experienced harassment and threatening behaviour, so threatened violence, that kind of thing. Looking at their characteristics, again, we see young people being overrepresented, so a higher rate of people who are under 25, and more than 3/4 of people in this group were women. Again, a higher rate of people who are bisexual or same-sex attracted, but this time a higher rate of people from European descent. You'll note much higher rates of psychological distress, and about a third were experiencing financial stress, and again, higher rates of people who are single. The others aren't as interesting, so we'll move through them more quickly. So now it's class 3, and the average number of crime types experienced by people in this class was 3.5. This class had the second highest proportion of people who'd experienced harassment and force or violence. And those in the category of harassment included threats to injure family members, threats of violence, that kind of thing. And the only way that this group diverged from the overall sample was that it had a higher proportion of men, and otherwise it looked like average. The next class, class 4, again, the average number of crime types people experienced was just over 3. Every person in this class had experienced burglary, and 1/4 had experienced trespass. 1 in 5 had had objects stolen from outside their home, or had about 10% had had vehicles tampered with. So you can see this is a group predominantly experiencing property crimes. In terms of how they differed from average, there was a slightly higher proportion of Asian peoples, but this was not a statistically significant difference, perhaps due to the small group size. Higher rates of people who had a disability, and high rates of financial stress, which perhaps, again, that was measured at the survey date. Maybe it was a result of those victimisations. Looking now to class 5, the average number of crime types, again, was just about around 3. This class is really interesting because all of the people in this class had experienced threatening behaviour, but there were 4 different categories. Everyone in this class had experienced someone acting in a way that made them feel genuinely fearful or alarmed, but they hadn't experienced threatened violence, threats to injure family, or threatened damage. So it was kind of unspecified other behaviour that made them feel fearful. And all of the other crime types were present at quite low rates. So these are people who have felt fearful and experienced some other kind of victimisation. So really interesting. And compared with the overall sample of poly victims, a slightly higher proportion of women and people of European descent, higher rates of people being partnered, and most were not experiencing psychological distress and not experiencing financial stress. So this is a really interesting group of people to understand more about. Okay, I'm nearly there. This is class 6, and this is the very large class. So basically half of our sample of poly victims fell into this category. And so a third of people in this class had experienced trespass, and it had the highest proportion of people who'd experienced fraud and deception. So unauthorised use of a document, being tricked for money, cybercrime, things like that, as well as experiencing robbery and theft, those kinds of things. Compared with the overall sample, this group included a high proportion of people who were 65 plus. They're more likely to be partnered, and again, they had lower rates of psychological distress and financial stress. So it might signal that there's something about this group that's made them vulnerable to experiencing property crime, fraud, and deception. Okay, finally, this is class 7. And this is what I would call our highly victimised group. So on average, people in this class experienced 10 different kinds of crime in the last year, in the last 12 months. And it's great because this is based on self-report, so I'm not relying on police data here. This class had the highest proportion of people who'd experienced force or violence, so assault, harassment of basically any kind, burglary, property damage, fraud and deception, sexual violence, robbery and theft, so everything basically. compared with the overall sample, this group actually had a higher proportion of mid-aged people. So compared with the first two classes I presented that were highly victimised, that were more likely to be young people, this group is in the mid-age category. More than 3/4 were women, again a higher proportion of people who were bisexual, and more than half were Māori, Indigenous New Zealanders, and a high proportion of Pacific peoples. And again, higher rates of psychological distress, financial stress, with more than half of people in this group experiencing those, and a higher rate of people being single. So returning to that slide I showed you before, that just showed you kind of how our people were separated into groups. I've now replaced the sizes of the groups with the average number of crime types they've experienced in the last 12 months. And what you can hopefully see is that these smaller groups have had experienced more crime types. So I've thrown a lot of information at you. Let's synthesize it. So starting from most crime types going down to least, at most we had class 7. So this was our highly victimised group of mid-aged people. They were experiencing high rates of interpersonal violence and as well as acquisitive crime, which maybe this points to the flag mechanism being relevant here, where there could potentially be stable characteristics increasing their risk to several different kinds of crime, perhaps. And again, just summarise their characteristics at the bottom there. Next was class 1 with 6 crime types on average, and here we saw higher rates of property kinds of crime, followed by some kind of interpersonal things too. So perhaps, again, there's a flag mechanism going on. We actually saw a similar pattern for class 2, except it's only interpersonal violence is what we're seeing here. And while both groups included a high proportion of young people, class 1 involved more men and class 2 involved more women. Class 3 was harassment and assault. Again, there's interpersonal violence kinds of victimizations. And the only way this group diverged from overall was that it included more men. Class 4 was experiencing mainly property crimes, and very similar to the average again. Class 5 had experienced threatening behaviour, and then really not high rates of other things. So the unifying thing for this class was that experience of acts as threatening. And class 6, again, was a group who were affected by property crimes, fraud and deception, and were more likely to be 65 plus. So returning now to Boost and Flag, maybe looking at those groups, you, like me, had some ideas about who those people might be, what their experiences might be. But the problem I encountered was for every explanation, I could come up with a counter explanation as well. So, for example, I talked about potentially with class 7 having potentially characteristics that indicated that they were vulnerable to different kinds of victimization, potentially by different offenders. It could also be that they were experiencing victimizations that increased their vulnerability to subsequent victimizations, whether it's the same person or a different person. And we saw in a presentation this morning that when children experience maltreatment, it can be happening in different ways. So it's absolutely not the case that just because it's a different crime type, it must be a different person. So there are a few limitations I want to raise. Due to the way that the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey is structured, people are asked those screener questions, those 31 questions about different crime types at the start. And if they say yes, then they have to give more detailed information, and crimes are then of the same kind, are kind of collapsed together in forms, and that means we can't pinpoint whether details relate to one crime or another. So say you experience 3 instances of assault, 2 by a family member, 1 by someone else. It would just say 3 assaults, family yes, someone else yes. And then if there were other details about the event, they'd be collapsed in. So part of helping us unpack these Boost or Flag explanations would be looking at, well, is it the same person? And we don't know. But what we can do is we can look at who the person is, so whether it is family or non-family. So that's something we'd like to do in the future. The other thing too is, because of the way crimes are collapsed like that, we can't look at kind of the temporal succession, like how quickly they're happening in time to one another. And therefore it's kind of difficult to look at ordering of things. But what we can do is, if people have experienced different kinds of crime, the survey asks people how many months before today was that. So assuming people have perfect memories, which we all know that they do, we might be able to order different crime types and look at the boost and flag explanations. So for example, some of our findings, class 7, class 1, class 2, could support flag, so groups having characteristics that make them vulnerable, but boost could also be applying. So really, it's an interaction. It's probably a little bit of boost, a little bit of flag, but our findings do point to there being different mechanisms for how characteristics and routines come together to influence poly-victimisation. I was not expecting to find groups that made sense in the way that these do, and I'm really excited to keep looking at ways to explain that, potentially looking, because we do have an integrated data infrastructure, potentially looking at other variables, other sources of information to actually tell us more about those people's lives. But the key thing I think comes out of this in terms of prevention, service provision, is that when someone comes to the attention of police or a service provider after experiencing victimisation, we should be asking what else is going on in their lives, because we have got a lot of services that are set up on single issues. So for example, maybe it's sexual violence, or even if someone's coming to attention for having experienced fraud or deception, we should be asking what else is going on so we can treat the person in front of us, not just one specific victimisation experience. So that's all from me. I have to show you this disclaimer. These are not official statistics from Stats New Zealand because of using the IDI. But thank you for listening. And this is a policy brief that I talked about at the beginning, where we first got interested in understanding poly-victimisation a bit better. So thanks all.